Hello, my name is Greg Kaiser, and this is Think Supersystemic. We focus on the science, art, and economy of interconnectedness. Today's guest fits squarely in the science category. Dr. Bernardo Reis hails from Rockefeller University, where he studies the human microbiome. He's going to share some very powerful ideas about the interconnectedness between the human body and the human microbiome. Well, hello, Bernardo. How are you?
Good, very good. Thanks for having me, Greg.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited about this conversation. Can you, to start it off, can you give a bit of information about kind of an overview of what the microbiome is for folks who don't know, and perhaps tell, after that, give a little bit, kind of an overview of what we know about the microbiome and to kind of paint a picture of like, the upcoming research and so forth.
Yeah, sure. So the microbiome is kind of the community of different organisms that live within our body. So you could think of the major microorganisms that people talk about when they discuss the microbiome is mainly bacteria, but it also involves fungi and viruses and even phage, which are viruses that infect the bacteria, and so on. So there are many different components in this microbiome per se. But I think the major focus of research has been the bacteria community that basically is distributed all over our body, and there are some places that they are more common than other places in our body, but they basically colonize all the surfaces of the human body. And I think what is interesting about this microorganism community is that there are a few aspects that are very interesting regarding this interaction. First of all, for many years we always thought of bacteria as being a bad thing for you. So you didn't want to be in the close proximity with any bacteria, otherwise you would be somehow infected, right? And it could cause some harm. But for many years now, we understand that this is not only happens all the time, but it's actually beneficial, and it's beneficial in many different ways. And I think I can talk a little bit about like the major fields that these discoveries have led the science to, especially regarding these beneficial aspects. For example, so for example, there is the metabolic. The most obvious is the metabolic beneficial aspects of this bacteria colonization. So in the gut, as we eat and have to digest food, many of these molecules that are present in different foods, they wouldn't be fully digested by our digestive system if not by the help of bacteria that break down these molecules to a certain level that then we can further digest and absorb these molecules. So this is a very clear beneficial aspect of the colonization of bacteria. But more than that, the bacteria also helps to fine-tune our organism to better absorb these nutrients by shaping the physical aspects of our gut. So bacteria interact with the surface of our intestine, the cells that compose the surface of our intestine, and this makes the cells produce some substance that will be then used to break down molecules for digestion as well, but also interacts with other components of our body to then regulate, for example, hormones like insulin and glucagon and leptin, which are all involved in food intake, absorption, and even behavior towards eating or not eating. So there are many aspects. So these are very complex, of course, and involves many different cell interactions and this stuff. Even the neurons can be affected in this pathway that goes from bacteria to our cells.
How many?
I think, yes.
Oh, no, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, do we know how many microbes are in our guts, like, and the breakdown of like how many bacteria, how many fungi, how many viruses, etc.?
Yeah. So the number of bacteria is believed to be in the trillions. So meaning that we now these numbers have changed a bit, of course, because those are quite estimation of the real number. But what people believe now is that there are as many bacterial cells as are cells in your whole body. So they are in the range of the trillions of cells.
Wow.
Yeah. So fungi. That number should be a bit lower. The fungi is a much bigger organism, more complex, and I think by size you could imagine that it's a bit lower, but the precise number is less known. And then virus, I mean, this number it can be like astronomical, and it's very hard, especially if you include the viruses that also infect the bacteria, the so-called phage. And then these numbers can be as big as, I don't know, very, very large numbers, maybe 100 times more than the number of bacteria, 100 trillion or so.
Any idea on the numbers of different species of organisms?
Yeah, so there are, this number also has been, we have been adding more and more species, but the number of possible species of bacteria in the human gut is about in the thousands of different species, but each person should be colonized by hundreds of these bacteria, maybe 100, maybe 200, maybe 300 different families of bacteria or genera of bacteria. And this can vary a lot between one person to another person, which of these thousands of bacteria is actually colonizing your gut. And they can be classified in very big groups of bacteria. And these groups seem to have like more or less the same function, even though they are different species.
So interesting. Can you talk now specifically about your research? I understand you're focused on that layer in between the microbes and the human body. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing and what you're finding and so forth?
Yes. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the microbiome is always colonizing the surface of our bodies, and the skin is the most easy to understand kind of surface and how this would be in contact with the environment and bacteria and all the stuff, which happens as well. But the gut is very interesting because the gut is actually, although one could think that it's inside your body, it's actually outside your body still, right? So you're kind of a donut shape, and this hole that goes through your body but is still facing the environment, which is the gut, is actually the largest area in contact with the environment because of the villi and microvilli and all this stuff. If you stretch the gut, it would be like the size of a football field.
Wow.
So this whole area is kind of in contact with your with the outside world, and everything you eat, everything you ingest will bring not only food components that can induce some sort of immune response as well, for example, allergies and all this stuff, but also the bacteria. So the bacteria is basically found this niche to colonize. It's very humid, it's very very full of food, right? So we are feeding the bacteria all the time. Let's put it. So it's a great environment to colonize. But so with this in mind, so you have this area where it's full of bacteria in a very close proximity to your body, and it's actually separated by a single layer of epithelium, different from the skin, which you have like this very strong layer with multi-cell layer, which then protects you from not only bacteria but also from scratch and all this stuff. The wall of the gut is very thin. It's only one single epithelial cell, and it's full of this bacteria, right? So it's interesting how you could imagine how this came to evolve like this, but it's interesting to notice also that this area of the gut is where the majority of the immune system is actually located in your body. So the amount of immune cells in this epithelial layer, it's higher than any other part of your body. So there is this constant interaction between this microorganism in the lumen of the gut and the epithelial cells and the immune system in your gut. And this is very interesting because it co-evolved, right? So not only the human organism evolved the immune system to kind of somehow interact and establish this barrier between the outside world and us, right? But the bacteria that colonize us also co-evolve to be able to somehow to not trigger a very strong immune response against them, but also be able to kind of colonize this area without causing any harm. So, and what I've been studying is how this interaction takes place and how the immune cells see the bacteria and how this contact shape not only the microbiome, but also how the microbiome is shaping the function of these cells. So we've been learning that. So we have, for example, germ-free animals, which you can. They are born in this isolator, so they are never exposed to any bacteria. So they have a very. So they are completely empty in their gut, and it's interesting to notice that their immune system is also affected because of that. So their immune system is actually weaker in the absence of bacteria in the gut. They lack some types of cells of the immune system in their gut. The immune system does not respond as well as the immune system of a regular animal to not only to things that go into their gut, but also systemically. So this effect it's also translated to the system itself. So if you immunize a germ-free animal, they will produce less antibodies. So if you vaccinate to any particular molecule, they will produce less antibodies to that molecule than an animal that is full of bacteria in their gut, showing that the immune system somehow co-evolved to not only allow but to learn from this bacteria on how to operate as a system.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I've been looking into all these correlations, and I've been mostly focused on a specific immune cells called gamma delta T cells, which are mainly mainly reside in this layer of the epithelium, and how they move around the epithelium. So they are constantly surveilling the epithelium, and how they can, if a bacteria, then there is a pathogenic bacteria, for example, Salmonella, which is a common pathogenic bacteria. If it invades the tissue, how the cells respond to it as a first responder, and how this response then shapes the whole intestine and brings the intestine to a more defensive kind of.
Now, do those T cells move in the mucosal layer? Do they move around with the bacteria? Like, how are they getting around in that system?
Yeah, so they move just underneath the epithelial cells in an area that we call it's kind of between the basement membrane, so the gut. So you have the epithelial layer, which is the outer layer of the gut, and then just underneath you have a basement membrane that kind of keeps together the rest of the gut, which we call lamina propria, kind of a net of collagen that keeps everything kind of in shape. We call it lamina propria. It's full of other T cells, B cells, macrophages, and many other cells are within this containment of the basement membrane. And these gamma delta cells are just above this basement membrane, but below the epithelial cells. And they basically move within this space that visually seems to be very small indeed. And they squeeze in between the epithelial cells. And they move quite fast. We made some, we can do live imaging of these cells moving inside the gut of animals. And we can see that within half an hour, they can, as a group, all the cells together, in half an hour, they can basically scan your entire gut.
Wow.
So every half an hour, every single epithelial cell of your intestine is being touched by a gamma delta cell. So sensing something and then reacting to it.
Wow. So now understanding the role that the mucosal layer plays, and the microbiome in general, can you talk a little bit about the difference between somebody who has an unhealthy digestive system and has all the problems associated with that, and somebody who has a healthy digestive system? Is there any way for us to diagnose or differentiate between those two types of individuals?
Yeah, there are certain bacteria that have been associated to, for example, this chronic inflammation in the gut, like IBDs or IBS or Crohn's disease. But it's hard to predict when, based on the microbiome, when someone will flare, let's say, or will start this kind of disease. There is, of course, a genetic component, since this whole interaction it's kind of happening both ways. So there is a genetic component that can, for example, individuals that have defect in IgA production, which is an immune globulin antibody that is produced in the gut and secreted to the lumen. People that have defects in IgA can have a very different microbiome, which then can affect this whole interaction. And there are certain types of bacteria that are strongly associated to individuals that have the disease already, but it's hard to predict. One thing that is being very confusing in the field, or very hard to tackle, is what is a healthy microbiome? How do you define a healthy microbiome? Especially because there is a huge variation. There is somehow a huge variation in the population. And yet many people are healthy, the majority of people are healthy. So it's being hard to predict. We know when someone is sick. We can recognize that there are certain bacteria that are always associated to a sick kind of phenotype.
Can you tell me some of the ways that the microbiome impacts human behavior, at least what we know, what we might think, what are some theories, what is the research that's being done with regards to behavior and the microbiome?
Yeah, sure. So there is this new field that has been growing quite fast, which people like to call it the microbiota gut-brain axis. So people have been investigating how the gut and the brain communicates for quite a long time now. maybe 10 years or so, a decade or so. And people have noticed since a long time that there is a huge amount of neurons associated to the gut. So these neurons are mostly, of course, their primary function is for gut movement, gut peristalsis, but there are many of these neurons that project back to the central nervous system. So there is always this, there has been always this idea that either the gut can sense and communicate directly to the brain, and in this way, somehow whatever happens in the gut could have an impact in our behavior. And what people, as they start investigating, what people soon realized was that there was a big contribution of the microbiota into this communication. So people have learned that the microbiome, or the bacteria that reside in our gut, they can, by complex ways, somehow, sometimes not really understood, but they can produce many metabolites, but also they can produce some molecules that can bind directly to neurons, like analogs of neurotransmitters, or even molecules that are very, very, very similar to neurotransmitters. And they can basically directly communicate to neurons, fire them, and this can lead to a direct communication to our central nervous system. And I mean, there are many studies showing that there is a big relationship between, for example, the kinds of bacteria you have in your gut and depression. So maybe explain this a little bit better. People that have depression have is usually associated to a set of microorganisms in the gut that is different from people that don't have depression. It's always hard to define causalities in these things, because people do take a lot of drugs to control depression and all this stuff. But even in some papers, even like accounting for this this problem of the direct effect of different drugs into impacting directly the microbiome composition, there is still significant differences between the microbiome of depressed people regarding to just control people, but also, and you can interrupt me anytime, but also there are some links of autism and microbiome, usually associated with also certain kinds of bacteria, but still very, very early days of this these findings. There is also a possible link between microbiome and Parkinson's disease.
Okay.
So there are many different central nervous system related problems and associated to change in the microbiome.
Okay. So is there hope that someday we'll be able to treat some of these disorders through the microbiome? If in fact we find there's some causality, that we might be able to then replace the microbes that somebody has with some other ones, and hope for,
Yeah, so that's the hope, right? So the hope is that as this set of bacteria, or sometimes a single species of bacteria, are being cataloged and linked to some of this human disease, we can start playing around in ways that we never thought of doing, like introducing some sort of bacteria, or specifically depleting some groups of bacteria that could that could help treat patients with very different kinds of brain associated disorders.
would you say, would it be accurate to say that, with all of these disorders of the gut that kind of have some behavioral component, is there a lack of diversity in these cases, or is that blanket statement? Are we not able to kind of say that, like, in most cases, that there's a lack of diversity of microbes in the guts of these individuals?
Yeah, in some cases, the lack of diversity seems to be one of the major links. So a less diverse microbiome, so very narrow groups of bacteria being overgrown in your gut could lead to some of these problems. And also, for example, and then you could think that the overuse of antibiotics could be causing some of this neurological disease.
Interesting.
So those are very interesting thoughts, and there are many data supporting this hypothesis of a less diverse microbiome leading to many problems, not only these neurological disorders that we just mentioned, but also all the other disorders that we have been discussing earlier.
And what's your thought on on fecal therapy? So fecal therapy, when you take the poop from a healthy person and you put it into the colon of an unhealthy person, sounds like such a crazy idea. I mean, you're essentially putting at least hundreds of species, trillions of organisms from one person to the other. What's your thought on how that might be used in the future for disorders like these types of disorders?
Yeah, so they actually, people are doing this kind of experiments in preclinical models by transferring fecal matter, as people call fecal matter transfer, from patients with some depressive disorders into, for example, into animals, and then like mice, and these animals do become depressed. Showing that there are components in that fecal matter or the microbiome that is directly leading to some of the behavior we are observing. So I think we're gonna be doing this more and more often. People do this for other kinds of disorders like IBD and IBS, but soon we're gonna be, I guess, treating. I think, of course, people might be a bit not so eager to do this kind of treatment for obvious reason, but we could think of really identifying the set of microbes that could be useful and just give them to people in a pill or something like that. So I think as we evolve and we gain more information into what kind of microorganisms are actually important to cure or to mitigate this kind of disorders, we're going to be using them for sure.
Interesting. Do you think, understanding, like, I know, like, the FDA and the European FDA, the approval process for something like this has got to be incredibly difficult, right? Because usually they look at one molecule, one disorder, but this is like literally thousands of different species or hundreds of different species that they're bringing to somebody. Do you think that the FDA is becoming more aware that this type of thing is coming down the pike, or do you think it's just going to be a fight to get that, something like that, approved for, say, depression?
I'm really not very familiar with all the details of FDA approval into new drugs. I know that some things are not really considered drugs, and they are easier to go around. For example, usually probiotics are not seen as drugs, and those things don't require, they go as a supplement, a food supplement or something like that. So they don't really require FDA approval, but I think these things are not really, for now at least, they are not really used as a treatment, right? It's more like a personal usage from, and also, but although they do come from, they do have some scientific proven scientifically that they somehow can help. But I guess as these treatments become more as a clinical kind of treatment, the FDA might have to approve some of these treatments for sure. But unfortunately, I don't have all the details on this thing.
Okay. So in your thing, so just thinking about the microbiome and all the related diseases and so forth, and the mucosa layer, which you focus on specifically, in like 10 to 15 years, where do you think we'll be? Like somebody comes into a clinic or a doctor's office and they have a specific disorder, and now we know that it's somehow attached to a specific microbe in the gut. How do you envision that, like that clinical service is going to be provided, or how people are going to get that information, or how that doctors are going to understand, like, I'm just curious how it seems like an incredibly complex thing to put into practice at the end of the day.
Yeah, for sure. It's very complex, but I think we are going forward into this kind of individual medicine, as they like to call, or there are some other words for that too. But basically, I think you go into a doctor, they get a sample of your microbiome, like your fecal, a fecal sample. They can basically sequence this for a very small amount of money. So this will be like very routine kind of test. So you just sequence and say, okay, this is your microbiome. You have this and this and this. I see you're lacking this, or I see this is overgrown. So let's tame here. Let's add more here. And so you could think that this might be possible to modulate your microbiome diversity and just sequence it, just check how it is, and then add or remove some stuff based on more precise treatment.
Sure,
I think that's a possibility. Maybe not in 5 years, but maybe in 10, 15 for sure. This could be.
And by then, maybe we'll know more about specific microbes or specific kind of family, a collection of microbes that translates into the potential for depression, or translates for potential of other issues. Yeah. Exactly.
I think this is all very exciting, very new, but and what it's cool is that the price of all these things like sequencing and especially sequencing, which is the major bottleneck right now. I mean, it's getting cheaper and cheaper, and so this is going to be very easy to do. At least identifying the microorganisms that one has in their gut.
Interesting. So it seems to me like the research that you're doing, the research into microbiome in general, is kind of leading us back in a way to a more holistic approach to medicine, or has the potential to, if a lot of the research proves out and we kind of can put it into the clinic and so forth. Would you say that's kind of pretty accurate?
Yeah, I think for a long time we scientists in general, so science in general, have divided the systems and separated all the systems, like the immune system, the nervous system, the digestive system, in parts, so we can dissect and understand how the whole thing works. But of course, we are a single organism, and we are subjected to everything the environment brings us, or we sense from the environment. So it's not surprising that in the end everything is connected, right? So I think this holistic idea is definitely something that we are going towards, and as we understand more the system separately, we can now start connecting it and seeing how one affects directly or indirectly affects the other.
Cool. I can't wait for the health system that kind of emerges from this type of research and this and a deeper understanding of the microbiome and so forth. Could you, so just to kind of wrap up, could you tell me, you know, everybody's thinking about their immune system these days and how well they're prepared for a given virus or infection, coronavirus specifically. Can you talk about, you know, I know you can't say anything about coronavirus specifically because there's not, the science isn't there yet, but can you talk more generally about what kind of diet somebody can take on to kind of improve their microbiome and therefore improve their immune system and kind of make themselves more resilient to disease in general and so forth?
Yeah. So those are very important questions, and maybe we are not completely prepared to answer this kind of questions. What I can tell you for sure is that we know that a more diverse microbiome makes you more resistant to many kinds of viruses. So there are not only virus, but disease in general. So there are interesting work showing that a more diverse microbiome in animals protect them from many different infection models or cancer or things like that. And the main reason is because of the immune system being more well developed or mature. Let's put it this way, more mature. So if you can increase your microbiome diversity, and the main way we know that you can easily and rapidly affect your microbiome is by food, diet. So in that way, if you can diverse your diet, right, eat more different things and maybe even seasonal things, so you can, with time, change from one microbiome to other microbiome, or enrich some certain bacteria at some season and some others in other seasons. So you keep kind of changing your flora and diversifying your flora. So I think that would be it. Of course, it's not a very direct answer to your question, but it's more like let's put a holistic answer.
Okay. Yeah.
This issue.
This has been really helpful and interesting. Thanks so much for joining the call and sharing your thoughts, and hopefully, some folks will find it as meaningful as I have.
Cool.
All right. Thank you, sir. Okay. Bye-bye.